Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 152. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of The Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Lars Emmerich about his conspiracy thriller series featuring female protagonist Sam Jameson. Lars admits that having a female lead for stories in this genre is a bit unusual. But if murder, espionage, and smart, tough, feisty female government agents are your thing, you'll want to check out this series. Inspired by Tom Clancy and similar authors, Lars was fascinated by the way they constructed their stories in two main respects. First, the idea that what is right in front of you is rarely the whole story. And second, the ability to weave several different storylines into a compelling ending. Lars drew upon these lessons when writing his thriller series, and he admits that when it comes to creating main character Sam Jameson, it's less about learning who she was and more about discovering who she wants to be. In this episode, I'll chat with Lars about his writing journey, how he changed his method of selling books by working directly with readers, and why he thinks that writing books always ends up being more like a science project than an art project, about halfway through the story, as well as a few other things coming up. Lars Emmerich, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and an honor.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your espionage thriller series. You've got 10 books out in this series, the Sam Jameson series. If you don't mind, introduce us to these books and what inspired you to start writing them.
Yeah, thank you. That's right. The Sam Jameson series is the main series. And I think one of the things that makes the Sam Jameson series, if not unique, at least a little bit unusual, is that Sam is not short for Samuel, but for Samantha. The lead character, the protagonist, is a female. And that's not something I had noticed a great deal of as I read in that genre over the years. You know, when I was... I'm a long way from 23 now, but when I was 23, I sat down to work on my first book. And fortunately for everyone, life intervened, and I was away from it for 18 years before I actually sat down in earnest to write novels, which is great because at 23, you don't have much to say. But what really inspired my love of the genre was I had stumbled across a Tom Clancy book way back in the day and promptly read every word that Clancy wrote. And so what really intrigued me about this genre in general, certainly about the way that Clancy and others like him constructed their stories, is it's two things. The first is this sense that what's right in front of you is rarely the whole story. They're mundane, everyday things that can have a deeper meaning, maybe even on a national or international level. And so that idea was really intriguing. These small details could roll up like a snowball and create something earth-shattering as a result. And along the way, very, very intriguing. And the second thing I loved about the genre is the way that a couple of different stories could weave themselves together for a surprising and a compelling ending. And I really loved the challenge of starting each of these story threads with a vibe, with a general idea, or maybe even an idea for a character and a situation, and just seeing where things led, and then trying to discover how those things led together, wove together into a coherent story, hopefully a coherent story, hopefully also entertaining. So those were sort of the backdrops for how things began. And I wanted from the beginning to have a female protagonist. And I don't know if I have a clear reason for that other than that I didn't really notice a great deal of it in the genre beforehand. And of course, since then, there have been a number of female leads. And even at the time, there were a few. It just wasn't all that common. So that's sort of the genesis. I began writing in earnest when I had a job that required me to fly all over the country and spend days and weeks on end in airports and in hotel rooms. And I wanted something constructive to do with the idle time that comes with travel, other than just more of the job that I was doing. So it was a great way to sort of escape from that reality and a great way to build something that I felt excited about. And so that's the sort of the origins of how Sam Jameson and her world came to be.
And tell us a little bit more about Sam Jameson herself. How did you construct this character? Did she come to you fully formed, or was it a process to get her formed enough that she was ready to put on the page?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I had the depth of experience at the time to know whether or not a character was fully formed enough to really have a role. I think the process of creating Sam was more a process of discovering who she wanted to be, as revealed in the scenarios that I put her in. So she was a very high level in a male dominated world. And so she has a bit of a chip on her shoulder because she needed to have one in order to, first of all, survive, and then second, ascend the ranks in a dirty business, catching spies. And so what I think I had clearly was her voice. She's got a sharp tongue, but very also a heart of gold. And so how those things fit together was an interesting discovery process.
You've got 10 books out in this series. Do you have more planned for the series? Do you have an overall plan for the series and how you may ultimately end it, or do you just take it one book at a time?
I take it one book at a time, and even really it's one chapter at a time. I write reasonably detailed outlines, but that's a very creative process. I am often just as surprised by what winds up on the page as hopefully the readers are. And I'm these days more keenly aware of the downstream consequences that particular scenes may have. Like they change the entire course of future novels. But it really, just like the characters, for me, it's been as much a discovery process as anything else. Where does the story want to go? That's not a cliche. That will keep you guessing and also entertained. And hopefully the process is one that where you wind up with something where you don't really see what's coming. And so that carries through the series as well. I'm not sure where this will end up. It's taken some very unexpected turns, and it has brought Sam and Brock, her better half or her luckier half, however your point of view might be, into some very interesting circumstances. And that's what I'm currently exploring in the novel, the 11th in this series and the 13th overall. She's taken on a new role. I won't give away any spoilers for those interested in diving into the series. She's taken on a very new and unexpected role, one that she never envisioned for herself, certainly, and one that has global impact, which is quite interesting. And also quite daunting when you sit down to write a chapter or a scene, and the impacts are significantly more far-reaching than they were 10 novels ago. There's a little bit of it gives me pause for sure. I think a little more about where things might end up downstream, but I don't have an overarching plan mapped out for books 11 through 20. I am really working one chapter at a time.
let's talk a little bit about how the series has developed. Start us off with the first book in the series, The Incident, Inferno Rising. Tell us a little bit about that story, and then let's talk about how you up the ante, book after book after book.
Yeah, the first book in that series, really, you can sum it up in a couple of questions. The first is Sam Jameson in love with a traitor? Which would be a big deal because her job is to catch spies. And the second question is, where do you run when the good guys want you dead? And as it's a made-up position at the Department of Homeland Security, counter-espionage division chief. I don't know if that position exists. I suspect that it doesn't. But she's investigating or is called late at night to investigate a crime scene. And at this crime scene, she finds her own contact information in the victim's nightstand or on the victim's nightstand. So she's clearly more involved in the story than even she knows. Along the way, it becomes revealed to her quite painfully that there are elements of the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department who are also quite interested in potentially doing her harm. And that appears to be associated with some accusations that are leveled against her love interest, whose name is Brock James. And it certainly appears to her bosses at Homeland as though Brock James is a spy. And then by implication, Sam is in hot water as well. So the process of discovering what's really happening when the good guys are appearing to try to do you harm, and while you're forcibly estranged from your other half, that's difficult territory to find yourself in. So that really propels the story forward from there. Untangling what really happened. Is Brock really a spy? Are the good guys really trying to kill her? What's really happening? And that starts the whole train rolling.
And then where do you go from there? I imagine the idea is that you up the ante each time. The books get bigger, the stories get bigger, the consequences more dire. How do you keep growing it and yet try and keep the story relevant to just the characters on the page and make it feel real and personal?
I think that's maybe the ultimate question as it regards to writing mysteries and thrillers. You always have to up the ante, and of course, our readers have expectations for what has to be at stake. And in the thriller genre, it has to be a fate worse than death in most cases. And so, how do you keep turning the dial up? That's an interesting question, and I wouldn't be so presumptuous to say that I have it all figured out, except to say that I really like to embody the tropes that people expect in our genre in a new and unexpected way. I don't like repeating the specifics of a trope that I have seen before. I always want a twist to come at you in a new direction, from a new direction, something unexpected, something you've never heard of before, hopefully. And so the unexpectedness of it, I think, is an important element in the spy thriller genre. And the other part of it, I think, is the art of the interpersonal play between the characters. Because spies are, by definition, people who are deceiving just about everybody in their life. And so the particular way that they handle those deceptions, the way that words can be construed in multiple ways, I find that fascinating. And I think I really have an appreciation for snappy dialogue that's humorous and engaging. And maybe when you least expect it, I hope also there's some nuance there that you can reach back to later in the story when you fully understand the meaning of what was said earlier. So I don't know if I have a formula for how to keep it interesting, other than I just like to try to think of new things, new ways to approach the same angles. And hopefully readers find that compelling and engaging. Like I said, I think that's the quintessential question of all writers in any genre. How do you keep it fresh, new, interesting? How do you continue to keep people engaged?
Yeah. And let's talk for a minute about something you said earlier. You said you now pay more attention to the downstream consequences of scenes or dialogue or the actions of your characters. Have you found yourself in trouble in a novel because of something, say, a character insisted on doing earlier in the novel or in a prior novel? Have you found yourself backed into a corner ever?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I spend my author life in trouble, I think. So I feel painted into many corners, but I think that might be the way that I use to set myself up to hopefully find interesting and engaging and creative ways forward in the story. There are occasionally times, of course, as you develop a particular novel, the story may take itself in a direction that means you have to update what a character did or said earlier in the story. And of course, that's always a part of the process. But I think, and I don't know how this is for other authors, but the early parts of a novel for me are all just fun and joy, and I'm loving getting to know the characters and to discover how they react in these crazy scenarios. And then about the halfway point, I realized, oh goodness, all of this has to fit together some way. So then it becomes more of a science project and less of an art project to make sure that all the story elements tie together in a satisfying way.
Do you always know how each novel will end, or is that a surprise as well?
I never know how the novels will end.
Really?
I never know. Yeah. I'm usually, I would say I'm no earlier than 40% through a novel before I know exactly how it will end. But about that halfway point, I do always take a step back and really get serious about making sure the story elements fit together. Part, I think, of what has made the series enjoyable for folks is the fact that it does take unexpected turns and that characters find themselves in pretty tenuous situations. And I love for that to happen organically. And I also love to try to fix those messes in ways that are satisfying for the reader and that are interesting and that also fit with the integrity of the characters.
Well, let's talk about your readers for a second. You've got 10 of the books out in this series, and you mentioned 2 other standalone spin-off novels. Do you read your reviews, the reviews of your own books? Do you take on board reader feedback once the books are out? And does that ever influence what you write about in the future?
That's a very interesting question. And I'm unusual among authors in that in 2017, I figured out how to sell books directly to readers rather than relying on third parties. I do offer books on Amazon like everyone else does, but the main source of income and customers for me is the direct to reader marketing system that I've developed. And one of the beautiful benefits of that is that readers can reach out to me directly. And I, for many years, was able to keep up with all those emails, at least to have read them. It's gotten to a point where it's just not physically possible. But it's always been interesting to hear the different points of view. And there are certainly times when readers have made very, very helpful suggestions. And there are other times when the suggestions are not something I've taken on board. And also what's really interesting for me is the way that the same book can produce dramatically different responses in different individual humans. And so one of the great lessons of this process has just been that what a reviewer says is true for their experience with the book, but not likely true for everyone's experience with the book. And I've been really fortunate to have sort of a front row seat to that, and to have the ability to interact, especially with, their power readers who are very smart and who understand the genre very well, and who offer really brilliant feedback. I've certainly benefited from that. And I've also benefited from the perspective that, hey, at the end of the day, you're not going to please everybody. You may not even please most people. So you do have to approach the work with some degree of artistic integrity, so that you're not chasing what individual reviews sort of point you toward.
That's interesting. Your comment about not being able to please everybody. I imagine one of your goals at this stage is writing a book that at the very least, pleases yourself, and you hope pleases the characters that have now probably become like family at this point in the journey. How do you get to a point where you say, okay, I'm satisfied with this story? I think my characters are satisfied. Does that happen naturally? You come to the end of the book, the end of your initial draft, and you're happy with it all the time, always? Or are there times where you have to really work the manuscript over and over until you get happy with it?
I've had it happen both ways. I've had it happen where, at the end of the manuscript, I set it aside for enough time to forget what I was trying to say. And when I reread it, I'm left only with what I actually said, which is a thing. And it's a reason that writers shouldn't try to edit themselves, because we too often remember what we meant, and we are unable to process the way we actually rendered the idea. I've gotten to that point in the process and found some manuscripts that I really liked as they were, obviously with cleanup items, but I liked them in the main. There were others that I had to take another few passes at before I got to where I felt comfortable with the manuscript. And I have to say, in general, there's maybe only one or two books that I've published that I really feel are maybe the best work I could have produced at that time. I think I'm critical of many of my novels, and I don't feel that I have the whole thing figured out. And I don't think that's entirely uncommon. I think there are probably a handful of writers who are really more objective judges of their own work. I am not in that position just yet.
Is it still hard to let a book go? I mean, is it, after 12 of these books now, is it easier to put the book out into the world now versus the first time you did it? Or is it still difficult to let it go?
Well, it's harder because, I've been fortunate, and a bunch of folks have read this series, and many of them wait for the next installment very, very patiently. I feel the weight of their expectation. Like, I honor their appreciation of the series, and I want to do it justice. I want, when they read the next installment, to say, "Oh man, this was great. It was worth the wait. I love it. I can't wait for the next one to come out." And at the beginning, it was just sort of having fun. I didn't know where this would go. Of course, we all hope our projects go someplace, but there was not a whole lot of expectation about what might become of the series. Now it's grown into kind of a thing, and I do feel definitely the weight of expectation. I do want to really produce a satisfying novel, and at times that stands in the way of productivity. There's a thing that happens where, if you don't get the editor to take a coffee break while the creator is doing his or her work, you wind up with something that's flat, and that's overly cautious, maybe, and that's hemmed in and maybe restricted in a way. So I don't have a perfect approach to that, other than to try to be self-aware. for how I'm feeling in the moment and what approach I'm taking toward the work, so that I don't inadvertently create a bad experience by trying too hard to create a good one, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. I'm also curious, how much research do you end up doing for the books? Because you've mentioned that your books have at least a basis or an expectation that it will mirror or reflect some parts of reality. A lot of it you have license to make up, but there are elements of truth in what you write. How much research do you end up doing to get that balance right? And is that something you enjoy doing? Is the research a joyful part of the writing process, or is that drudgery for you?
That's a great question. It's a combination of a couple of things. The first is that I spent 20 years, 20 plus years doing work in the national defense industry. I flew F-16s for 20 years, and 16 of my 20 years in the Air Force. And I worked on a number of programs beyond that. So I had a good bit of exposure to the way things tend to work in the national defense game. Of course, individual agencies all have their own character and all have their own idiosyncrasies, if you will. But the general environment, I spent a lot of time in DC. And so that backdrop, just the vibe, the feeling, and the sensibility, I think came naturally. I had to be very careful to stay far away from topics that I knew too much about, just so I wouldn't get in trouble with Uncle Sam. So there was a fair amount of research involved in the particulars of the story elements. And now, I've been out of the national defense game for a good bit of time, and so I'm more research dependent, but I'm very curious. So it's always an enjoyable part. And the way that I do it is I don't necessarily compile a bunch of research. I get to a point in a particular chapter where I want more richness. I want more detail. I want to understand better how things tie together out in the real world. And it never fails that when I take the bit of time to research that, there's at least a half dozen other ways that pop up that could be quite interesting connections to make in the story. So it's a part of the process that I do enjoy, just because I'm a curious person and I enjoy learning about particularly things that are not widely known or widely publicized or widely understood.
And you've got 10 of these books out in the Sam Jameson series. You're working on number 11. You've mentioned the 2 standalone books. How do they relate to your main series? And do you have plans for creating series around those novels?
I do. They're spin-offs. So the protagonist in these 2 novels are they're additional characters in the Sam Jameson series. And the first that I wrote is called Descent. And that stars a character named Peter Kittredge, who features prominently in the very first novel in a quite unflattering way. And that trend sort of continues in Descent. And the second is called Monarch. And that's based on a character also who made his first appearance he made his first appearance in the 3rd book in the series, which is the first book I wrote. And he's been in the mix somehow, some way, shape, or form since then. His name is Quinn, and he has an extremely interesting take on life. He is very involved in what people refer to as the pointy end of espionage. He does bad things to bad people. And the interesting discovery, I think, for readers is the extent to which he's got a good heart. And I really enjoy writing his character because I love his voice, and I love his perspective on things. And I love the way that he's a mixed bag, just like all of us, if we're honest. We have things that we do that other people would scratch their heads at. and we have things that we do that really represent our highest morals and virtues. And I think the same is true of Quinn, and that makes him a really interesting character to explore.
You've done a lot on your writing journey to date. Do you have things that you still want to do as an author, as a writer?
I enjoy telling stories. I also find them to be an important vehicle to air out and to explore some ideas about the way the world fits together. And so I think I don't have a particular destination in mind for this whole thing, other than to say that it's a process that I tend to enjoy. I don't obviously enjoy everything associated with running a publishing company in support of the books. I really do enjoy those times when I can sit down and create stories. And I really enjoy that, have always enjoyed that. And I think I'm just on a quest to tell a terrific story full of great sentences as well. And I think that's sort of the holy grail that most of us are looking to at least approach.
Right, right. Well, if people want to learn more about you and your books, Sam Jameson and her series, where should they go to find that information?
Thank you. Yeah. So as I mentioned, I sell mainly directly to fans. So the best deal at any given moment is always available at lars.buzz, LARS.BUZZ. And that'll take you right to the best offer of the moment.
Good. And how about social media or any other way for people to follow you or track you or get in touch?
I wish that I enjoyed social media, but I don't. And it's very hard to stay productive and also be present in my wife's and kids' lives by being, as it is. I can't imagine how hard it would be on social media. So what I can say is that whenever you purchase anything, whether it's a paperback or audiobook or ebook from my store, you are on the mailing list. And I was shocked to discover that people claim they enjoy the emails on the mailing list as much as they enjoy the books. So hopefully that's a perk. And it's also the best way to keep in contact with me, is just by replying to those things.
Excellent. Well, Lars, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with the Sam Jameson series, book 11 in progress, the 2 potential spin-off series that you have planned, the publishing of the books, the whole lot. So clearly you're very busy. Good luck with all of that. Congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published, as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author, or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.